Ethan Carter eased his Bentley to a stop, the engine purring softly as he stared out at the crumbling facade of the building ahead. At 38, he'd built a real estate empire in New York that most could only dream of. Penthouse views, private jets, the works. But here he was, parked in a gritty corner of the city where the streets smelled of damp concrete and desperation. His PR team had practically begged him to come, insisting a photo op at this homeless shelter would smooth over the headlines still buzzing about his latest tax scandal. "Show the world you've got a heart," they'd said. Ethan wasn't so sure he did anymore. He stepped out, the crisp October air nipping at his face, and adjusted his Armani suit. The shelter loomed ahead, an old brick heap with chipped paint and a faded sign that barely read Hope Haven. Inside, it was alive in a way he hadn't expected. Volunteers darted around, serving steaming trays of food, while kids chased each other, their laughter cutting through the hum of quiet conversations. Families huddled together on mismatched chairs, finding comfort in the chaos. Ethan felt like an intruder, his polished shoes clicking too loudly against the worn tiles. This wasn't his world. His was all glass towers and late-night deals, not folding tables and soup lines. He'd only been there a few minutes, nodding awkwardly at a volunteer who handed him a flyer, when something, or someone, caught his eye. In the far corner, near a stack of donated blankets, a woman sat on a metal chair, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. Her brown hair hung loose and messy, framing a face that looked too pale, too tired. She rocked the bundle gently, her lips moving in a soft hum Ethan couldn't hear over the chatter. He froze. Even from across the room he knew her. Clara Evans, his ex-wife. His heart slammed against his ribs. Clara, 34 now, had been the spark in his life once. A brilliant interior designer with a laugh that could light up a room. They'd met 4 years ago at a gallery opening, her standing out in a simple dress while everyone else drowned in designer labels. She'd talked about art and dreams, not money or power, and Ethan had fallen hard. They'd married fast, a whirlwind 8 months of late-night dinners and stolen weekends, but it fell apart just as quickly. Arguments about his endless work hours, her feeling like a trophy instead of a partner. 12 months ago, she'd walked out of their penthouse with a suitcase and nothing else. He hadn't seen her since. Now here she was, in a place like this, holding a baby. Ethan's mind raced. A baby? How? Why was she here of all places? He took a step closer, then another, drawn by a pull he couldn't name. Her head was bent low, focused on the infant, and for a moment he just watched. The way she held the child, gentle, protective, stirred something deep in him, a mix of guilt and longing he hadn't felt in years. Clara had always had that effect on him, cutting through the walls he'd built without even trying. He was halfway across the room when she looked up. Their eyes met, and time seemed to skid to a halt. Her face shifted, shock first, then something harder, colder. She tightened her grip on the baby, her jaw setting like she was bracing for a fight. Ethan stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his $1,000 suit, standing in a room full of people who'd probably never seen that kind of money in one place. "Clara?" His voice came out rougher than he meant, almost a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze flicked over him, his suit, his polished shoes, the watch that cost more than most people's rent, and then back to his face. "Ethan," she finally said, her tone flat, guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he tried to keep it light, but the words felt heavy, clumsy. His eyes dropped to the baby again, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, tiny hands peeking out. "Who's this?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She shifted the bundle closer to her chest, like she could shield it from him. "This is Noah," she said after a beat, her voice barely above a murmur. "My son." "Your son?" Ethan echoed, the words hitting him like a punch. He couldn't stop staring at the little face, round cheeks, a wisp of dark hair. His mind spun, trying to piece it together. Clara with a kid, here, in a homeless shelter. None of it made sense. "Yeah," she said, lifting her chin a little, daring him to push. "My son." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Questions piled up. How old was the baby? Who was the father? What had happened to her? But they tangled in his throat. He hadn't seen her in a year, hadn't known where she'd gone or what she'd been through, and now this. The Clara he remembered had been vibrant, unstoppable, sketching designs late into the night while he pored over contracts. This Clara looked like a shadow of that woman, worn down but still fierce in a way that made his chest ache. "Why are you here, Ethan?" she asked again, sharper this time. "This isn't exactly your scene." He swallowed, glancing around at the bustle of the shelter. "I'm helping out. A charity thing. My team thought it'd be good for—" He stopped himself, realizing how hollow it sounded. Good for his image, like that mattered right now. "I didn't expect to see you." "Same," she shot back, her eyes narrowing. "So what now? You gonna stand there gawking, or you got something to say?" He didn't know what to say, not really, but he couldn't walk away. Not from her, not from this moment. "Can we talk?" he asked, softer now, almost pleading. "Just for a minute?" Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. The baby, Noah, squirmed in her arms, letting out a small whimper, and she rocked him gently until he settled. Finally, she gave a tight nod. "Fine, 1 minute." Ethan pulled up a chair, the metal creaking under him, and sat across from her. Up close, he could see the lines etched around her eyes, the way her hands trembled just a little as she held Noah. She was still beautiful, even like this, maybe more so because of it. He wanted to ask a million things, but all he managed was, "How did you end up here?" Her laugh was short, bitter. "Long story, not one you'd care about." "I do care," he said, too fast surprising even himself. "Clara, I don't." She cut him off, her voice like a blade. "Don't act like you've been losing sleep over me. You didn't even call after I left." He flinched. She wasn't wrong. He'd let her go, buried himself in work, told himself it was for the best. Their marriage had been a mess by the end, shouting matches, slammed doors, her accusing him of loving his deals more than her. He'd figured she'd moved on, started over somewhere better. "Not this." "I'm sorry," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. They felt small, useless, but he meant them. Clara didn't respond. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to find the man she'd once known. Noah fussed again, and she shifted him to her shoulder, patting his back with a tenderness that hit Ethan harder than he expected. He'd never pictured her as a mom, not back then anyway, but seeing her now, it fit in a way he couldn't explain. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about any of this." "Yeah, well," she muttered, "you weren't around to know." The words stung, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Instead, he sat there, the noise of the shelter fading into the background, watching his ex-wife cradle a baby he hadn't known existed. A baby that might change everything. He didn't know how to fix this, didn't even know where to start. But one thing was clear. Walking away wasn't an option. Not this time. Ethan sat there, the metal chair digging into his back, but he barely noticed. Clara's eyes were locked on him, sharp and unyielding, like she was waiting for him to prove her right, that he'd bolt the second things got messy. Noah nestled against her shoulder, his tiny breaths steady now, a stark contrast to the tension crackling between them. The shelter buzzed around them, volunteers clattering dishes, kids giggling somewhere down the hall, but it all felt distant, like the world had shrunk to just the three of them. "So," Ethan started, his voice low, "you're here?" With a kid, and you didn't think to tell me? Clara's jaw tightened, and for a second he thought she might not answer. Then she shifted Noah slightly, her hand resting protectively on his back. Why would I? Last I checked, you didn't give a damn what happened to me after I walked out. That's not true, he shot back, louder than he meant to. A few heads turned their way and he lowered his voice, leaning in. I tried calling, Clara. You didn't pick up. You didn't leave a note. Didn't say where you were going. You just disappeared. She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. Oh, please. You called twice, maybe, then gave up. Don't pretend you were losing sleep over it. You had your buildings to build, your deals to close. I wasn't part of that anymore. He winced. She wasn't wrong, not entirely. After she left, he'd thrown himself into work harder than ever, drowning out the silence of their empty penthouse with late nights and bourbon. He told himself she'd be fine, that she was tough, that she didn't need him. Looking at her now, though, worn out, sitting in a homeless shelter with a baby, he realized how wrong he'd been. I should have tried harder, he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. I know that, but this, he gestured vaguely at her, at Noah. What happened? How did you end up here? Clara's gaze dropped to Noah, her fingers tracing the edge of his blanket. She didn't speak for a long moment, and Ethan wondered if she'd shut him out completely. Then she sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry a year's worth of weight. It's not some big mystery, Ethan. Life happened. I lost a big contract right after we split. Some client who didn't like the divorce drama tainting my reputation. Then the freelance gigs dried up. Rent kept climbing, savings ran out, and she paused, her voice catching. Here I am. He stared at her, trying to process it. Clara had always been a fighter. Scrappy, resourceful, the kind of person who could turn a blank room into a masterpiece with nothing but a sketch pad and grit. Seeing her like this, stripped down to survival mode, hit him harder than he expected. And the baby? He asked, his throat tight. Noah. When? How? Her eyes flicked up to meet his, searching, like she was deciding how much to give him. Finally she said, He's 3 weeks old, born right here in the city. I didn't plan it, if that's what you're wondering. 3 weeks? Ethan's mind churned doing the math. They'd split 12 months ago. 8 months of marriage, 4 months apart, before she must have gotten pregnant. The numbers didn't add up. Unless... His stomach twisted. Clara, he said slowly, is he? Am I? She cut him off with a look, sharp enough to slice through his hesitation. Don't, she warned. Don't ask something you're not ready to hear. I'm ready, he insisted, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. I need to know. Is he mine? The air between them thickened, heavy with everything unsaid. Clara's face softened for a split second, then hardened again. She took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping like she'd been carrying this truth too long. Yeah, she said quietly. He's yours. The words landed like a brick on his chest. Ethan sat back, his breath catching. His? Noah? His son? He looked at the baby again, really looked this time. The dark hair, the shape of his nose. Suddenly, he could see it. Traces of himself in that tiny face. A kid. His kid. Born 3 weeks ago while he'd been closing a deal on a skyscraper downtown, oblivious. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice cracking. You were pregnant, Clara, with my kid. And you didn't say anything? Her eyes flashed, anger sparking behind the exhaustion. Tell you? When? When you were too busy to notice I was falling apart? Or after I left, when you didn't bother to check if I was even alive? She shook her head, her voice rising just enough to draw a glance from a passing volunteer. I didn't know I was pregnant until a couple months after I left. By then I figured you'd moved on. I wasn't about to crawl back and beg for your help. I wouldn't have made you beg, he said, desperation creeping in. I would have been there, for you, for him. She snorted, a bitter edge to it. Right. Like you were there when I needed you before. You didn't even see me, Ethan. I was drowning in that marriage, and you were too busy playing king of the world to care. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. He'd been blind, wrapped up in his own ambition while she slipped away. He remembered the fights, her pleading with him to slow down, to be present. He'd brushed it off, promised her the world once he'd built it. And now here she was, in a homeless shelter, raising his son alone. I'm sorry, he said again, quieter this time, the apology feeling like it barely scratched the surface. I messed up, I know that, but I'm here now. I want to help. Clara's expression didn't soften. She studied him, her eyes cold, calculating. Help, she repeated, like the word tasted sour. What's that mean to you, Ethan? Writing a check? Showing up for 5 minutes to feel better about yourself? No, he said quickly, shaking his head. Not like that. I mean real help. Whatever you need. Money, a place to stay, anything. You're raising my kid, Clara. I'm not walking away from that. She didn't respond right away. Noah whimpered, and she adjusted him in her arms, patting his back until he quieted. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until she finally spoke. I don't need your pity, she said, her voice low but firm. Noah and I have managed this long without you. We'll keep managing. Clara, come on, he pressed, frustration bubbling up. You're in a shelter. You shouldn't have to manage like this. Let me do something, please. Her gaze hardened, and for a moment he thought she'd shut him down completely. Then she sighed, a tired, resigned sound that cut deeper than any insult. Fine, she said. You want to talk? We'll talk, but not here, not now. I've got enough to deal with. When, then? He asked, desperate to keep the door open. Tomorrow, she said after a pause. Come back tomorrow. I'll be here, but don't expect me to make this easy for you. I won't, he promised, holding her gaze. I'll be here. She nodded once, curt and final, then turned her attention back to Noah, effectively dismissing him. Ethan stood, his legs shaky under him, and took a step back. He watched her for a second longer, her bent head, the way she cradled their son, and felt something shift inside him. Guilt, yeah, but more than that, a pull, a need to fix this, to be better than the man who'd let her walk away. As he made his way out of the shelter, the cold air hit him like a slap, clearing his head just enough to realize what he was up against. Clara didn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And Noah, God, Noah, his son, he had a son. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. He climbed into the Bentley, the leather seats feeling too luxurious, too wrong after what he'd just seen. Tomorrow he'd come back. Tomorrow he'd start proving he wasn't the man she thought he was anymore. But as he drove away, the city lights blurring past, one question gnawed at him. Could he really make this right? Or was he too late? Ethan woke up the next morning with a knot in his stomach, the kind he hadn't felt since his first big real estate pitch 15 years ago. Sleep had been a lost cause. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's tired face, Noah's tiny hands, the shelter's cracked walls. He'd spent half the night pacing his penthouse, the skyline glittering outside like a taunt. All that success, all those millions, and here he was, a stranger to his own kid. By 6 a.m., he was showered, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of his usual suit, and out the door. No Bentley today. He took the subway, blending into the morning crowd, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. Hope Haven looked different in the daylight, less grim but just as worn. Ethan pushed through the front door, the smell of coffee and oatmeal hitting him as volunteers prepped breakfast. He scanned the room, heart thudding, until he spotted Clara near the back, feeding Noah from a bottle. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Progress, maybe." "You came," she said, not quite a question, her eyes flicking over his casual clothes. "Told you I would." He pulled up a chair, sitting close enough to talk but far enough to give her space. "How's he doing?" Clara glanced at Noah, who was sucking down formula with tiny, determined gulps. "He's good. Hungry but good." She paused, then added, "You don't have to do this, you know. Show up, play dad for a day, we're fine." "I'm not here for a day," Ethan said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm here because I want to be. Because I should have been here sooner." She didn't argue, just kept feeding Noah, but he caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt. Maybe hope. He didn't push. Instead, he spent the morning shadowing her, helping where he could. He hauled boxes of donated clothes, stirred a pot of soup under a volunteer's watchful eye, even tried changing Noah's diaper, fumbling with the tabs until Clara took pity and showed him how. She smirked a little at his clumsiness, and for a second it felt like old times, back when they'd tease each other over burnt dinners or botched DIY projects. By noon, he'd worked up the nerve to ask, "Can I hold him?" Clara hesitated, then handed Noah over, her hands brushing his for a split second. The baby was lighter than he'd expected, warm and squirmy, staring up at him with big dark eyes. Ethan's throat tightened. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, rocking him gently. "I'm your dad." Saying it out loud made it real, and he felt a rush of something. Pride, fear, love. He couldn't quite name. Clara watched, arms crossed, her face unreadable. "You're not bad at that," she said after a while. "Beginner's luck," he replied, grinning despite himself. She didn't smile back, but her shoulders relaxed a fraction. It was enough. Over the next few days, Ethan became a fixture at the shelter. He showed up every morning, ditching meetings and calls his assistant kept texting him about. He brought supplies, diapers, formula, a stack of blankets he'd bought on a whim, and started fixing things. A leaky faucet, a wobbly table, even the roof when a storm left it dripping. The staff warmed to him, calling him by name, and the kids started tugging at his sleeves, asking him to play. He wasn't just there for Clara and Noah anymore. He was starting to care about this place, these people. Clara noticed. She didn't say much, but he caught her watching him sometimes, her eyes softer than before. One evening, after Noah had dozed off in a crib the shelter kept for him, Ethan found her sitting outside on the steps, staring at the darkening sky. He sat beside her, the concrete cold through his jeans. "You've been here a lot," she said, not looking at him. "Yeah," he replied, keeping it simple. "Figured it's where I need to be." She turned to him then, her face half lit by the street lamp. "Why, Ethan? Why now?" He took a deep breath, the question hitting him square in the chest. "Because I screwed up. With you. With us. Seeing you here with Noah. It's like a wake-up call I didn't know I needed. I don't want to be the guy who walks away anymore." She didn't respond right away, just pulled her jacket tighter around her. "You say that," she said finally, "but words don't mean much. You used to say a lot of things. How we'd travel, how you'd cut back on work. Then you didn't." "I know." He looked down at his hands, the calluses starting to form from hauling boxes. "I can't undo that, but I can show up now, every day, if you'll let me." Clara studied him, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to find a lie. She didn't find one, or didn't call him on it at least. "Okay," she said softly. "Show up, then." That weekend he took a chance. "Hey," he said, as they sorted through a pile of donated toys, Noah gurgling nearby. "What if we got out of here for a bit? You, me, Noah. There's a park a few blocks over, nothing fancy, just some fresh air." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A park?" "Yeah, picnic maybe. I'll handle the food." He grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "No burnt toast this time, I swear." For a second, he thought she'd say no. Then she shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Fine, but if Noah hates it, you're on diaper duty all day." "Deal," he said, relief flooding him. The next afternoon, they met outside the shelter. Ethan carried a bag with sandwiches, apples, and a little jar of baby food he'd Googled how to pick. Clara held Noah, bundled in a new jacket Ethan had slipped into a donation pile earlier that week. They walked to the park, the late fall sun casting long shadows across the grass. Ethan spread out a blanket he'd grabbed from his place. Nothing fancy, just something soft, and they settled down, Noah between them. It was quiet at first, just the rustle of leaves and Noah's babbling. Ethan handed Clara a sandwich, and she took it with a murmured, "Thanks." They ate, watching kids kick a ball nearby, and slowly the silence turned comfortable. "Remember that gallery opening?" Clara said out of nowhere, her voice softer than usual. "Where we met?" He nodded, surprised she'd brought it up. "Yeah, you were in that green dress, talking about some abstract painting I didn't get. I couldn't take my eyes off you." She smiled, a real one, small, but there. "You pretended you knew what I was talking about, said it reminded you of a blueprint." "Total lie," he admitted, chuckling. "I just wanted to keep you talking." Her smile faded a little, but her eyes stayed warm. "Things were good then, before it all went to hell." "Yeah," he agreed, his chest tightening. "They were." They didn't dwell on it. Noah started fussing, and Ethan scooped him up, bouncing him until he giggled. Clara watched, her expression shifting, less guarded, more open. "You're getting good at that," she said. "Practice," he replied, winking. "He's a tough boss, though." She laughed, a sound he hadn't heard in too long, and something in him clicked. This, her, Noah, the park, it felt right. Not perfect, not fixed, but right. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky orange, he caught her eye. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara," he said, voice steady. "I mean it. I'll keep showing up every damn day until you believe me." She didn't answer, just looked at him, her face a mix of hope and fear. But she didn't pull away, didn't shut him down. And when they packed up to head back, she let him carry Noah, his little head resting against Ethan's shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Back at the shelter, Ethan kept at it. He got his hands dirty, literally, painting walls, patching leaks, even organizing a toy drive with some of his old contacts. The staff started joking he was their unofficial handyman, and Clara stopped hovering every time he held Noah. One night, after a long day, he found her sketching on a napkin at a folding table, a rough design of a cozy room. "What's that?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. "Just messing around," she said, but there was a spark in her voice he hadn't heard in a while. "Thought the kids here could use a better play area." He grinned. "Let's make it happen. I've got the cash, you've got the vision." She hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And as the days turned into weeks, Ethan felt the gap between them shrinking, not gone, but smaller. He wasn't just proving something to her anymore, he was proving it to himself. He could be more than the guy in the penthouse, more than the man who'd let her slip away. Noah's gummy smiles, Clara's quiet laughs, they were pulling him back to life, one messy, imperfect step at a time. But he knew it wouldn't stay simple. Nothing ever did with them. Ethan had started to feel like he was finding his footing. Weeks had passed since that first day at the shelter, and the rhythm of showing up for Clara, for Noah, for Hope Haven had become his lifeline. He wasn't just the guy in the fancy car anymore. He was the one fixing the heater, hauling donated cribs, or rocking Noah to sleep when Clara's hands were full. She'd softened toward him too. Not all the way, but enough that her smiles came easier, her words less edged with suspicion. They'd even started dreaming up plans together, like that play area she'd sketched, and Ethan could almost taste a future where they weren't just co-parents, but something more. That morning, he walked into the shelter with a coffee for Clara and a bag of bagels for the staff, whistling under his breath. The place was humming, volunteers prepping lunch, kids chasing each other around a stack of chairs. Clara was at a table near the back, Noah in her lap, sorting through a pile of mail with a crease between her brows. She didn't look up as he approached, which wasn't like her lately. "Hey," he said, setting the coffee down. "Brought you some fuel. Rough night?" She didn't answer, just kept staring at an envelope in her hand. It was already torn open, a single sheet of paper sticking out. Ethan's gut twisted. Something was off. "Clara, you okay?" She finally met his eyes, and the look on her face stopped him cold. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but a mix of hurt and something sharper, something that made his chest tighten. "What did you do, Ethan?" she asked, her voice low, trembling. "What do you mean?" He sat across from her, confused. "What's going on?" She slid the letter across the table. He picked it up, scanning the crisp letterhead, some law firm he didn't recognize. The words blurred at first, but then they snapped into focus. Request for paternity test. Noah Evans. Immediate compliance required. His stomach dropped. "What the hell is this?" "You tell me," Clara said, her tone icy. She scooped Noah closer, like she needed a shield. "Because I sure didn't ask for it." Ethan's mind raced. He hadn't done this. He wouldn't. But the timing, the name, it hit him like a freight train. James, his oldest friend, a real estate shark who'd been his sounding board since college. After that first day seeing Clara, Ethan had called him, spilled everything. Clara, Noah, the shelter. James had pushed him to get proof. Said it was smart to be sure before diving in. Ethan had brushed it off, told him no way, hadn't he? "Clara, I didn't," he started, but she cut him off. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to turn a few heads. "This didn't come out of nowhere. Someone had to order it, and you're the only one who'd care." "I swear I didn't do this," he said, desperation creeping in. He raked a hand through his hair, piecing it together. "It's James. I told him about Noah, asked for advice, not this. He must—" "James?" Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "Your buddy who's got more money than God? Why the hell would he care about my kid?" Ethan hesitated, the truth sinking in. James wasn't just his friend. He was a silent investor in Hope Haven, had been for years, through some charity tax write-off. Ethan had mentioned the shelter in passing, not thinking it'd matter. "He's tied to this place," he admitted, voice tight. "Funds it, or part of it." "I didn't know he'd pull something like this." Clara's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "So you told him about us, and he, what, decided to play detective? Or is this you, Ethan, covering your ass because you still don't trust me?" "No," he said, reaching for her hand. She yanked it back. "I trust you. I told him weeks ago before I even held Noah. I was freaked out, Clara. I didn't know what to think then, but I never asked for this." She didn't buy it. He could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the way she held Noah like he might vanish. Before he could say more, Linda, the shelter's coordinator, rushed over, her face grim. "Clara, we've got a problem. Just got a call. James Hartley's pulling his funding. Effective immediately." Clara's head snapped up. "What?" Linda nodded, wringing her hands. Said something about reassessing priorities. We're screwed without that money. Rent's due next week. Ethan felt the ground tilt under him. James wasn't just poking into Noah, he was hitting Clara where it hurt most. The shelter was her lifeline, and now it was crumbling because of him. "I'll fix this," he said, standing up. "I'll talk to him." "Don't bother," Clara shot back, her voice shaking. "You've done enough." "Clara, please." He started, but she stood too, Noah in her arms, and faced him head on. "You couldn't just leave it alone, could you?" she said, tears brimming but not falling. "I let you in, Ethan. I started to think maybe you'd changed, and then you pull this, spying on me, endangering everything I've built here. Why?" "I didn't mean—" He stopped, the words useless. He'd screwed up, even if he hadn't meant to. James had taken his dumb, panicked rant and turned it into a weapon. "Let me make it right." She shook her head, stepping back. "I need you to go. Now." He wanted to argue, to beg, but the look in her eyes, raw, betrayed, silenced him. He left, the shelter's chatter fading behind him as he stepped into the cold. His phone was already out, dialing James. It went straight to voicemail. "Call me back, you bastard," he growled, then hung up and hailed a cab to James's office downtown. The ride was a blur, traffic, honking horns, his mind spinning. James's building was all glass and steel, a monument to the life Ethan used to live. He stormed past the receptionist, up to the top floor, and burst into James's office. His friend, ex-friend, was leaning back in a leather chair, swirling a glass of scotch like nothing was wrong. "You've got some nerve," James said, smirking, "barging in after I did you a favor." "A favor?" Ethan's fists clenched. "You ordered a paternity test behind my back and yanked funding from the shelter. That's not a favor, that's sabotage." James shrugged, unbothered. "You needed to know if the kid's yours. And that shelter's a liability. Your ex-wife running it. Bad optics for me, especially with you sniffing around. I'm protecting my interests." "Protecting your interests?" Ethan stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "Clara's raising my son in that place, and you're punishing her for it. Call it off, James, now." James's smirk faded, replaced by a cold stare. "You're choosing her over me, after everything we've built?" "I'm choosing my family," Ethan said, the words slipping out before he could stop it. Family. It felt right, even now. "Reinstate the funding, or I'll find someone else who will. And I'll make sure they know why." For a long moment, James just stared, then sighed. "Fine, but you're on your own from here." Ethan didn't care. He'd won, sort of. He left, adrenaline still pumping, and headed back to the shelter. Clara was outside when he got there, sitting on the steps with Noah asleep in her arms. She didn't look up as he approached. "It's fixed," he said, breathless. James backed off. "The funding's safe." She nodded, barely. "Good." "Clara, I'm sorry," he said, sitting beside her, careful not to crowd her. "I didn't ask him to do that. I was an idiot to even mention you to him, but I swear I trust you." She turned to him then, her eyes red but dry. "You don't get it, Ethan. It's not just the test. It's that you still think you can control everything. Me, Noah, this place. I thought you were different. But maybe you're not." He opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "There's something else," she said, her voice breaking. "Noah's not yours." The world tilted. "What?" "He's not your son," she repeated, softer now. "He's my sister's. Lily, she died 3 weeks ago, right after he was born. I took him in. I told you he was yours because I wanted to see if you'd step up, if you'd care. It was a test, Ethan. and you failed." He stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. Not his. Noah wasn't his. Relief crashed into betrayal, then guilt all at once. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he whispered. "Because I needed to know who you really are," she said, tears spilling over now. "And I still don't." Ethan sat there, speechless, as she stood and walked back inside, leaving him alone on the steps. The twist cut deeper than he'd expected. Not just losing Noah as his son, but losing her trust all over again. He'd thought he was building something real. Now it was crumbling, and he didn't know if he could fix it. Ethan sat on the shelter steps long after Clara walked away, the cold seeping through his jeans, the weight of her words pinning him in place. Noah wasn't his. The kid he'd held, rocked, started to love. Not his blood. It should have been a relief, a clean break from a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but it didn't feel clean. It felt like a gut punch, hollowing him out. Clara's test, her lie, hadn't just exposed his doubts, it had stripped bare everything he'd been trying to build with her. She'd wanted to see if he'd step up, and he'd stumbled right into the trap she'd set. He could have left then, walked back to his penthouse, his deals, his old life. No one would have blamed him, Clara least of all. But as the streetlights flickered on, casting shadows across the cracked pavement, he realized he didn't want to. Noah might not be his son, but the ache in his chest didn't care about DNA. Neither did the way he felt about Clara. Messy, complicated, real. He'd lost her once because he hadn't fought hard enough. He wasn't doing it again. The next morning, he was back at Hope Haven before the sun was fully up. Clara was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal, her movements stiff, her eyes shadowed from a night he guessed she hadn't slept through either. She froze when she saw him, spoon hovering midair. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat. "I told you I'd show up," he said, stepping closer but keeping the counter between them. "I meant it." She set the spoon down, hard enough that it clattered. "Ethan, stop. You don't have to do this anymore. Noah's not yours. There's no obligation here." "Maybe not," he said, holding her gaze. "But I'm not here out of obligation. I'm here because I want to be. For him, for you." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for a lie, but he didn't flinch. "You don't get it," she said, softer now, almost pleading. "I lied to you. I used you. Why would you still want this?" "Because it's not about the lie," he replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his throat. "It's about what came after. Holding Noah, fixing this place, being with you. It woke me up, Clara. I don't care if he's not mine by blood. I want to be his dad. And I want us. Whatever that looks like." She stared at him, her hands gripping the counter, and for a moment he thought she'd tell him to leave again. Then she turned away, busying herself with the oatmeal, her shoulders trembling. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered. "Not after everything." "I know," he said, stepping around the counter, close but not touching. "I'll earn it. Every day, however long it takes." She didn't respond, but she didn't send him away either. That was enough for him to stay. And he did, day after day, week after week. He threw himself into the shelter harder than before, turning his guilt into action. He tapped his network, not for pity donations, but for real change. Job leads for residents, a grant for repairs, a partnership with a local daycare so parents like Clara could work. He didn't flaunt it, didn't ask for credit. He just did it. Clara watched him, wary at first, keeping her distance. But slowly she let him in again. He'd catch her sketching designs for the shelter's new playroom, and they'd sit together, tweaking plans over coffee. He'd take Noah off her hands when she was swamped, walking him around the block until he dozed off, humming off-key tunes that made the baby giggle. One afternoon she handed him a paint roller without a word, and they worked side by side, turning a drab wall into a bright mural of trees and stars. She didn't say much, but her silence felt different now. Less like a wall, more like a bridge. Months slipped by, and the shelter transformed. Fresh paint, sturdy furniture, a hum of life that hadn't been there before. Ethan traded his penthouse for a modest apartment a few streets over. No more skyline views, just a place close enough to walk to Clara and Noah. He didn't miss the luxury. It felt like shedding a skin he'd outgrown. The residents started calling him Ethan the Fixer, half joking, half grateful, and Clara stopped correcting them when they assumed he was Noah's dad. One crisp spring evening, he found her outside, sitting on a bench he'd built for the shelter's tiny garden. Noah was toddling around, chasing a leaf in the breeze, his dark curls bouncing. Ethan sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "He's getting fast," he said, nodding at Noah. "Too fast," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "I can't keep up." "I'll chase him for you," he offered, grinning. "Got plenty of practice now." She laughed, a real, unguarded sound, and it hit him how much he'd missed that. They sat there, watching Noah stumble and giggle, the air soft with the promise of warmer days. "You've done a lot," she said after a while, her voice quiet, "for this place." "It's not enough," he said, turning to her. "Not yet." Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "It's more than I thought you could." He took a breath, the words he'd been holding back spilling out. "Clara, I know I can't erase what I did. Walking away back then, doubting you now. But I'm not that guy anymore. You and Noah, you're my world. I don't care whose blood he's got. I want to be here, with you, building something real." She didn't answer right away, just looked at him, her face soft but unreadable. Then she reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, warm and tentative. "I've been scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared to believe you, scared to need you again." "You don't have to be," he said, squeezing her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." Noah toddled over, plopping down at their feet with a triumphant squeal, and Clara laughed again, scooping him up. Ethan watched them, his chest full in a way he hadn't known it could be. "What if we tried?" she said suddenly, looking at him over Noah's head. "Really tried. Not just for him, but us." He nodded, too choked up to speak at first. "Yeah," he managed finally. "I'd like that." From there, it wasn't instant. Trust didn't snap back like a rubber band, but they built it, piece by piece. They took Noah on picnics, cooked dinners in her tiny shelter apartment, laughed over his first wobbly steps. Ethan kept pouring into Hope Haven, turning it into a community hub. Classes, job fairs, a rooftop garden he'd surprised Clara with one weekend, string lights twinkling under the stars. She designed it with him, her sketches coming to life, and he saw the fire in her eyes again, the Clara he'd fallen for years ago. One night, after a long day, they stood on that rooftop. Noah asleep downstairs with Linda watching him. The city sprawled out below, quieter than usual, the air cool against their skin. Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket, his hands shaky but sure. "Clara," he said, turning to her, "I've spent the last year trying to show you who I can be. I'm not perfect. I never will be. But I love you. I love Noah. Marry me again. Let's make this forever." Her breath caught, her eyes glistening as he opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, silver with faith etched inside the band. Nothing flashy, just them. She looked at it, then at him, and for a heartbeat he thought she might say no. Then she stepped closer, her hands framing his face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan." He slipped the ring on her finger, pulling her into his arms, and she kissed him, soft at first, then fierce, like she was letting go of every doubt she'd held on to. The world faded away, just the two of them under the stars, the shelter humming faintly below. A month later, they married right there on the rooftop. It was small, shelter residence, a few friends. Noah waddling down the aisle with the rings tied to a ribbon around his wrist. Clara wore a white dress she'd found secondhand, simple but stunning, and Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. They'd vowed to love, to fight, to stay, promises they'd broken once but wouldn't again. Noah clapped when they kissed, the crowd cheering, and Ethan felt like his heart might burst. That night, after the music died down and the guests trickled out, they sat on the roof again, Noah curled up between them, asleep. The city lights winked in the distance, a backdrop to the life they'd carved out. "I never thought we'd get here," Clara said, her head resting on his shoulder. "Me neither," he replied, his arm around her. "But I wouldn't trade it." She tilted her face up, her eyes warm. "I love you, Ethan." "I love you too," he said, meaning it more than he ever had. Noah stirred, mumbling in his sleep, and they laughed softly, their hands linked over his little body. It wasn't the life Ethan had planned. No penthouses, no headlines. But it was better. Messy, hard-won, theirs. And as the stars shone overhead, he knew they'd keep fighting for it. Together, every single day.